Okay. So 3, 2, 1, start.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nora Valenzuela. I am the chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, Executive Board, and our staff, I wish to welcome all of our guests and also our honorable speakers, Ambassador Bodie and Ambassador Jackson. Our event today will focus on issues that some of you may be familiar with in detail, and others will be getting visibility to it during our event today, Libya and our collaboration and competing interests with the country. I'm happy to say that we have guests from all over the US with us today, and my colleague and our board member, Thomas Sparmer, will be providing you the detail on how the questions will be addressed and conducted. So with that, I wish to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us, and I'm turning it over to Tom. Tom?
Thank you, Nora. So we are going to have the conversation between Ambassadors Bodie and Jackson for approximately 40 minutes. And then we're going to allow about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the conversation. So we'll ask all of you who are in attendance to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom screen and just type your questions right in there in the Q&A box, and we will retrieve them at the end of the talk and hopefully get to most of your questions. With that, we can move on with the program. Those of you who have attended our webinars in the past are probably aware that we pride ourselves at the World Affairs Council of Orange County in bringing you highly distinguished speakers who are authorities in their respective fields. But you may not be aware that we also pride ourselves in bringing you very distinguished program moderators. And today's moderator is no exception. Ambassador Janine Jackson is a retired senior foreign service officer and retired colonel of the U.S. Army Reserve. She was ambassador to Burkina Faso from 2006 to 2009 and to the Republic of Malawi from 2011 to 2014. She also served as a diplomat in Switzerland, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Kenya, Afghanistan, and Iraq. She played a key role in the opening of our embassies in the foreign Soviet republics after the collapse of the Soviet Union. She led the team that reopened the US Embassy in Kabul in 2001 and played a key role in reestablishing the US Embassy in Baghdad. She is a recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Honor Award for her work in Iraq. In her earlier career, Ambassador Jackson served 10 years active duty in the US Army. She continued her military service for an additional 20 years as a reservist while pursuing her foreign service career. Ambassador Jackson holds a bachelor's degree in art education from Hastings College and an MBA from the Florida Institute of Technology. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, I am delighted to welcome our moderator for today's program, Ambassador Janine Jackson. Ambassador Jackson? And we've got you on mute. That's how we always like to start our Zoom call.
I'm so pleased to be joining members of the World Affairs Council of Orange County and their guests. And I'd just like to let you know that I'm speaking to you from the coast of North Carolina. When my wonderful colleague, Colonel Richard Downey, who is your program committee chair, asked me and another retired US ambassador who would be the best person to speak to you about Libya, we both replied simultaneously, Peter Bodie. So I'm really honored today to introduce you to Ambassador Peter Bodie, who served as US ambassador to Libya from 2016 to 2019. Ambassador Bodie's experience made him the best person for that job at the time, as he fostered productive interagency cooperation while managing the complex issues related to Libya. Prior to Libya, Ambassador Bodie was US ambassador to Nepal, where he helped lead the international response to the April 2015 earthquake there. He was my predecessor as U.S. Ambassador to Malawi, where poverty alleviation was the focus. And Ambassador Bodie and I worked together at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad as we coordinated the embassy's role in the complex transition of U.S. combat forces out of Iraq. His other assignments were wide-ranging to include Pakistan, Germany, India, Denmark, Bulgaria, and Guyana. Since retirement, Ambassador Bodie has continued to lend his expertise to U.S. diplomatic efforts. Ambassador Bodie's father also served as a diplomat and ambassador, and his wife Tanya was also a member of the Foreign Service. Now, before I ask the first question, I would like to define one acronym, and that is GNA, because Ambassador Bodie will probably use that acronym frequently. GNA is the Government of National Accord. It's the interim government for Libya that was formed under the terms of the Libyan Political Agreement, a United Nations-led initiative signed 17 December 2015. So Ambassador Bodie, you were appointed ambassador to Libya by President Obama, continued into the Trump administration, and then retired. But in 2018, you were called from retirement to be chargé d'affaires for the Libya mission. Can you describe for us how your positions and how U.S. Libya policy evolved during that 4-year period?
Thank you, Janine. Well, first of all, I want to just thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to speak today about a subject that's very dear to me. I have to say it's a great honor to be on the same stage and venue with my old friend Janine Jackson, Ambassador Jackson. And I'd just like to briefly describe how I found myself there and what I arrived to in Libya when I took on the position. As Janine mentioned, I was appointed by President Obama, and I arrived at post in January of 2016. But when I say at post, I wasn't in Libya, which was one of the key things. I'll keep stressing that today. See, as many of you know, had closed the previous year, and I was posted in Tunisia, and we had basically what we called the annex in Tunisia, the LIA, the Libya External Office, where we performed all the functions of an embassy, but we did it from afar. This was a unique challenge, it was a unique management challenge, it was a leadership challenge, and it was a policy challenge because we weren't in place, we weren't there. But in terms of how the policy evolved, our policy, fortunately, during the period I was both serving as an active ambassador, during the period I was gone, and then when I was called back, and even today, has remained fairly consistent. We have always, as the government, we have supported the UN-sponsored Government of National Accord to lead to a peaceful transition and eventual elections and a new constitution in Libya. This has been a multilateral approach. It has not changed. Our policy has not changed dramatically during the last 4 years. And in fact, I was there first during the transition. I was there when the Trump administration came in. And I think it was happenstance. I happened to be back in Washington in consultations, but I was actually there the day we briefed the president on Libya and the policy. And he signed off on a policy in the Trump administration, which largely carried on the exact same policies that we were doing in the Obama administration. This certainly made my job easier, but it also showed the world we were consistent in our support for the GNA, and we hadn't had any major change in that policy. The one sort of different thing that did happen in administrations is when I arrived, we first, in addition to myself as the ambassador, the bilateral ambassador, we had a special envoy, Jonathan Weiner. And Jonathan and I worked together very, very closely on Libya policy. We didn't have competing roles, we had complementary roles. And given the fact that Libya policy was very complex, there were a lot of meetings, there was an awful lot going on. I handled all the traditional embassy roles. Jonathan handled a lot of the roles in Washington. I was very fortunate. Jonathan and I became good friends. We worked incredibly closely together, and our skills complement each other. I also had the great fortune of Jonathan having been a long-term political associate of Secretary Kerry. So he had access to Secretary Kerry, and we were able to help shape policy in a way that was very, very helpful. When the new administration came in, that position went away and it was never filled. So I took on both the roles and continued to conduct the business that way.
That was really interesting, Peter, that you described the job of a special envoy versus the US ambassador. It happens often, and it's a delicate balance on who does what and how US policy is carried out. Thanks for adding that.
Well, Janine, you're absolutely right. But I have to say, I think Jonathan and I prided ourselves on that. We got together so well. And in fact, at one point, I had to go back to the States for personal reasons. And I asked Jonathan to actually be nominated to come out and serve as charge during my month-long absence. That's the sort of level of trust and level of cooperation we had. And as everyone knows in life, when you're able to cooperate at that sort of level, you get more things done.
Peter, you were heavily involved in supporting the previous UN-led effort for a peaceful transition in Libya that resulted in the Government of National Accord. Could you give us your view of this effort and how it worked, and how closely you worked with the United Nations Special Representative?
Yeah. In a nutshell, the effort with the GNA, it continued to work. Obviously, Libya was led, but it never led to the eventual elections and a new constitution, a more permanent transition that we had all hoped for. And there's a lot of reasons for this, which we'll spend a lot of time today discussing. But a couple of things there is that the United States always felt that the only successful way we could have any success in Libya was through a multilateral approach. So our approach was always to work very, very closely with the special representative for Libya. When I first got there, it was a gentleman named Ambassador Martin Kobler, a German gentleman. And he was replaced later by a distinguished scholar, Ghassan Salameh. And throughout all of these efforts, we realized that we all had to work closely together. We couldn't do anything, none of us could do anything alone if we didn't work together and support the other effort. The UN had the lead on this. But to give you an idea to the degree we work closely together, when Ghassan was appointed, my British colleague, Ambassador Peter Millet, and my French colleague, we actually flew to Paris before he officially was there to meet with him. So we could explain that we were all in this incredible challenge together, and we wanted to meet with him and coordinate with him. And we set up a successful relationship there that really moved the ball and created a level of trust that I think was certainly in my career one of the most unique efforts I've ever seen. We were successful in some things, obviously we weren't successful in everything. But while we all worked so closely together until General Haftar invaded Tripoli and later on, this effort worked. And I have to say that the fact that we could backstop each other and have a consistent policy worked very well. Stop there.
So you mentioned that you were posted to Tunisia and the embassy operated from there because of the security circumstances. I'd like to note that this is not the only situation in which the ambassador has been located in a different embassy while accredited to a different country. For example, the US Embassy in Nairobi hosted the charge d'affaires to Somalia for many, many years. So could you describe in a little bit more detail how being away from the country affected your ability to advance US interests and promote the peace process?
I'm happy to, Janine. Let me explain. Janine and I are both very senior ambassadors, and I have been at some of our largest embassies in the world. I was the deputy in Pakistan, I was consul general in Frankfurt and in Iraq, where we had literally thousands of people working for us. But managing this small external office was one of the greatest management challenges I ever had. I had an incredible staff, but we did the work of an entire embassy with basically 12 people, but we did it from afar. We relied on a lot of regional support. But the main problem we had is when you're an ambassador, a US ambassador, wherever you are in the world, you're engaged. People look to you for your opinion, they look to you for your advice, and they look to you for help. It's something we all do. Janine, you know this, you're one of the most engaged ambassadors I know. What we found is being in Tunisia rather than in Tripoli, it was very hard to do this. Now, I have to say with my Libyan colleagues, I am forever grateful and that they were always willing to come out to Tunisia. They did. My house, my office became, I think on an average week, we'd have anywhere between 10 and 20 visitors coming to the mission or our external office in Tunisia to meet with us and did this. This included the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister came out regularly and would meet with me and Ghassan in Tunisia, but it was a very awkward way to do business. The other thing we found is because the Libyan leaders were not where we all were. And I'm not just saying we weren't the only embassy at this time. We had virtually all the foreign embassies were out of Tripoli. They initially had gone to Malta and then all moved to Tunisia because then we found that's where many Libyans came when they were not staying in Tripoli. We all were in this circumstance. So we probably had a dozen embassies there. But we found we also had to fly around the world to meet people. I think I met the Prime Minister, New York, London, Cairo, Amman, the UAE, numerous times. So it meant there was an awful lot of shuttle diplomacy. My last year there, I probably did over 100,000 miles of shuttle diplomacy, which is unheard of as a bilateral ambassador. You just normally don't do that. It was a very, very difficult challenge. At the same time, we were trying to maintain an aid mission or an aid effort where we were providing traditional development assistance to Libya. We were trying to maintain democracy efforts. We were trying to maintain educational exchanges. As ambassador, I felt incredibly strongly that even though we weren't there, it was my responsibility to keep as much of the normal work of an embassy going in Libya as possible. And we did that. I was incredibly proud that despite all the challenges and some added challenges later on when we had travel bans and things like that, we were able to keep a high school exchange going. We keep students going to the States to study. We were able to provide training in things like historic preservation and how do you do these things. We did an awful lot of different things like that and did an awful lot of good work. And for that, I am forever grateful to just an incredible staff at what we called the LEO, the Libya External Office. We actually found that we had to market ourselves because we were sort of unique in the Foreign Service. So we had called ourselves the LEO. We actually had a mantra. I think no mission too large, no detail too small. We're the LEO and we do it all. And it was true. And we had to get this done because in addition to dealing with the Libyans in Libya, the international community, all of the various different countries involved, we also had to deal with Washington and the various aspects and the whole interagency. This was a very tough challenge. One of the things it meant is that in addition to our normal workday, I'd say 3 days a week, I would be back in the office somewhere between 9 and 2 in the morning doing secure video conferences with Washington. That was just the nature of the beast. The reason I mention all this is that as we get into what happens next and with the new agreement and the new US role with the new administration, I feel very strongly that one of the key elements to any increased US engagement with Libya will be we have to move forward in looking towards reestablishing some sort of presence in Tripoli. How that looks, what that is, I leave that to the people who are there. I'm not looking at something that's an enormous embassy, but it's just there's no substitute for being there. I don't want to belabor this point, but there were a few times I was only able to get into Tripoli 3 times or into Libya 3 times during my tenure. This required a Herculean effort with the US military, our diplomatic security people, all sorts of arrangements to keep us safe. But we would go in and we'd be limited to 3-4 hours at a time. But I'll never forget, there was one time I think we flew into Misrata where in 2 hours I was able to meet with 4 ministers and get about 3 months of work done just because we could sit across the table and talk to each other. There's no substitute for that. And that's where we really have to be on the ground to advance US interest and to help the Libyans move forward in their own political future.
Wow, that's amazing, Peter. I know you described to me having to go into Libya with significant military and security support. My husband happened to have worked in Libya twice, and it was during a more peaceful time, so he didn't have restrictions. And I'm going to divert a little here. While you were in Libya, were you able to visit UNESCO, any of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites? My husband was able to, but as I said, he was there at a little more secure time.
No, sadly, I think one trip I was at the airport, another trip I was at the Prime Minister's office as a naval base right on the coast. Another trip I was at the airport in Misrata. But what you're saying about the historical sites, it's just another example of just how much Libya has to offer the world. And that's one of the reasons we worked so hard to do cultural preservation. We were training their professors in how to prevent their artifacts. We did a special session with the Libyan police force on how to prosecute people who stole historic artifacts. Mm. These were all things people would wonder, why were we doing this when there were so many other serious issues going on? But I felt it was critical that regular business has to go on. And anything we could do with that regard was very, very important. For example, we were supporting the Libyan Boy Scouts, another effort. It was just something you have to do. And the more engagement we could take on, the better.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador Bodie, during your tenure, the U.S. successfully carried out a large-scale air campaign to get rid of ISIS. Can you please discuss that effort and coordination with the Government of National Accord? And I'm just wondering if they were very good partners in the global war on terrorism.
Thanks, Janine. Our government, the United States, conducted an incredible effort. This was all to rid Libyan soil of ISIS. And it was an incredible, successful effort. We played a role in it. Quite frankly, the larger role was played for our military colleagues, particularly at AFRICOM. But it took an incredible amount of coordination to get all this done. What I'm particularly proud of, and I'm proud that the United States did this, was done in coordination with Libyan forces on the ground out of Misrata, who handled the land side of it. But we were able to do this in a way that there was very little civilian casualties and as little as possible damage to properties and buildings and stuff. It was a classic a textbook exercise in how this can be done when it's well coordinated. I worked very closely with the combatant commander in AFRICOM and Stuttgart. This was all being coordinated both with the White House, with other parts of the interagency in Washington. But I have to say that none of it was done without the blessing of the GNA, the leadership. It was all coordinated with the Prime Minister. And this was something they had to do. This was their soil, but they understood that as long as this menace was on the ground, it threatened their sovereignty also. So they were very supportive of all the efforts we did. And we did this and some other efforts too. And I want to say the other thing the GNA was very supportive is in any effort we had to bring people to justice for the murder of our colleague, Chris Stevens, from earlier on.
Wow. Ambassador Bodie, there's a famous Libyan general called Khalifa Haftar. He was an early Qaddafi cadet, and he eventually actually became a US citizen while living in Virginia for 20 years. In 2019, he and his Libyan National Army attempted, but failed, to capture Tripoli. So we'd like to hear more about this attempted capture of the Libyan capital, and also whether the US had tried previously to bring Haftar into the peace process. That is before he invaded Tripoli. And tell us a little bit about your interactions and perceptions of him.
Sure. It's actually a very interesting story from a number of ways. General Haftar was actually rescued by the United States and given asylum in the United States many, many years ago because of what had happened between him and General Qaddafi. It's an interesting story because although he's an American citizen and lived in the United States for many, many years, I think there's a natural assumption that that would make us have undue influence on his decision-making process, or that somehow he would think like we think or immediately take to our positions. This obviously was not the case. My first interaction with him happened during the Obama administration. Jonathan Weiner and I went and met with him. We had a very long, I think 4 or 5 hour meeting with him. And it was a contentious meeting. We didn't come to any conclusions, but it was useful because even when you disagree with people, one of the things we all learn in diplomacy is you have to keep speaking. You have to keep the dialogue going. Well, after the change of administrations, I felt very strongly that I wanted this going. I got permission from Washington to go back, and I proceeded to then have a series of exchanges. I imagine, I've lost count, I think 5 or 6 with General Haftar in various capitals in Cairo, Rome, UAE, Amman. And we got to know each other over these discussions. We always had very frank discussions. We didn't agree on many, many things, but we always felt the meetings were important enough. And I would start every meeting saying that no matter where we end this one, it's important we keep this going, and he agreed. In terms of what happened in 19 is, he's been a force and a political force in Libya for quite some time. And I think there's a general consensus that certainly I had and others had, that he would always be part of this, whatever the solution of whatever happened in Libya, but he wasn't necessarily the solution. One of the things we, as the United States, when you want to partner with us, we're a nation of laws, we're a nation of rules and regulations. And when you want to partner with us, you have to agree to abide by international law. But one of the main things you often have to agree to is you have to have civilian oversight over the military. And this, as you can imagine, was a bone of contention with the good general. We spent many, many hours talking about it. I wish I could say I had convinced him that it could be otherwise, but we had a very frank dialogue. My last meeting happened with him in April of 19, shortly before. This is after I was called back. But you have to also understand something is one of the things that happened with General Haftar is other countries, UAE, France, Russia, gave him a sort of recognition of that he had a unique role in Libya. They treated it almost as a head of state. Well, the United States didn't do that. I always felt that if you wanted that sort of recognition by the United States, you had to come and accept the terms that there was civilian oversight of any military effort. And this we never got to. He continued to get UAE support and Russian support, and some French support as he did the invasion of Tripoli. Obviously, this is a bone of contention, and with the new agreement going forth, hopefully we're going to walk it back. As an individual, in fairness to him, he considers himself and clearly was a Libyan patriot. He felt he had the answers to move the country forward. He was a military man. He never had any civilian stuff. We used to tell him too that if he had agreed to civilian oversight of the military, he could run in an election, and if he were elected in a free and fair election, he would be recognized for that. But I think a couple things have happened too, that is that since the invasion of Tripoli, the actions that happened in the months before that, his unwillingness to take members of his staff who were they're fairly credible accusations of serious human rights violations in some of the battle actions that happened. This has taken away from his, I think he would have a hard time being accepted by the entire Libyan population, and it would make it running and winning a lot harder than it could have been a year, perhaps a couple of years ago. I respected talking to him. We had a very frank relationship. I know he respected me. He was upset when I said I was retiring, and it was our last meeting, and he was glad when I came back. We had a very frank dialogue, but I think what you find in our line of work is that you can have that kind of relationship, but it doesn't mean you agree to the terms, the positions. And I think there's been a little bit of confusion there, but we've never given the United States, and the United States government has never given him the recognition as the solution to Libya's problems that he wanted. Mm. And this is worth discussing for a minute, Janine, because the French government can treat him like a head of state. He can go to Russia. But we forget sometimes that being recognized by the United States as the legitimate leader, that's what really matters. And we didn't do that. We continue not to do that, correctly do not. I want to say at the same token, while all this was going on, Prime Minister Siraj was brought to the United States. He got a session with President Trump as the legitimate leader of the country. And there's a message there, and I think it's a very important message. And if you want the United States support and recognition, there's a certain set of rules you have to play by.
Mm-hmm. Good. You've mentioned a couple of other countries that were heavily involved in Libya, including Russia and France. Could you briefly discuss the roles of these nations and how, or if the U.S. coordinated well with them?
Yeah, happy to. I think maybe if we have time, just take a quick geographic sort of tour around Libya. If you look at the neighbors, you see that the neighbors basically all have a fairly healthy relationship with Libya. Morocco hosted the first peace negotiations. The other neighbors, Tunisia, Algeria, desperately want peace in Libya. The Egyptians also have worked hard for peace in Libya. We don't always agree with their position, but they have very legitimate security interests. They share a long border. They have strong economic ties. I forget the exact number, but I think at one point, over 1 million Egyptians were living and working in Libya. And this has gone on for a long time. The Italians have a long historical relationship with Libya. They have significant economic interest there with their oil and offshore. The UAE obviously is playing a role. You have Turkey is now playing a role. France has an interest, but I think the French interest is more on counterterrorism and security. And the British also played a very positive role in all of that. The other thing that came up is the whole issue of migrants and how this would become a domestic political issue, certainly in Italy, less perhaps somewhat in France. But I think with the terrorism incidents that happened in Europe, that was affecting a lot of different things.
That leads me to the next question. Actually, there's been a lot of human tragedy in Libya, and it especially as related to migration from the rest of the continent of Africa. Libya has become a launching point for migration to Europe. Could you just briefly comment on that?
Yes, I can only comment that it is a terrible, terrible human tragedy. And I wish we could have done more. The United States worked with the international agencies, ICRC and those. We funded a lot of programs, but it still continues. And until Libya becomes a more stable place where the rule of law plays a much more serious role, as you know, whenever things break down, and we've both experienced it in Iraq and Afghanistan, where when the rule of law breaks down, there's always people looking to take advantage of those who are in the most dire need. Sadly, the migrants going across find themselves in that category. This is something we all have to do a better job, and these poor people deserve better, and I think we'll move forward there. But back to your other question, I just want to say that we did coordinate closely, but I think there was two things going on. One, people would coordinate they'd say things in public settings, they'd agree to UN Security Council resolutions, and then they'd break them. And this is certainly the case with the UAE. This is certainly the case with Russia, certainly. And that makes a difference. And sadly, that's what happened. We worked very, very closely with the British. I can't remember when we had a single disagreement policy with them.
Wow. I know that Libya has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, which makes it potentially a very wealthy country. Can you comment on the Libyan economy and how the U.S. has engaged the government of national accord to try to get the economy moving?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Libya is an incredibly wealthy country. And unlike every other crisis country I've dealt in, perhaps with the exception of Iraq, it wasn't a question about money. The money was there, the natural resources were there. When I was in Libya, virtually all Libyan adults and families were receiving a monthly stipend from the government based on the oil income. And that's what kept the country going. Where we engaged is we were trying desperately to help them work together to get a budget done, work together to get how the oils was done, to get the economy moving. Working with the British and the Italian governments, we started something called the Libyan Economic Dialogue. This initially was the three of us, and then later we took the lead. And it was this unique situation where, as the American ambassador, we would host the Libyan Economic Dialogue in Tunis, and we would bring different elements of the Libyan government together. The finance ministry, the tax ministry, the national bank, and they would basically have their meeting under our auspices. I would chair the meeting and facilitate the meeting, but I would explain that it wasn't a US meeting, it wasn't even an international meeting. What it was is we were just acting as the facilitators to bring them together. We actually broke some ground where they were able to get one of the national budgets done. They agreed on how the funding would be done, how the taxation. They were looking at revaluing the currency, eliminating some subsidies. This work continued, but it hasn't, clearly it's not all done yet. There's an awful lot more to be done. And with the separation of the two governments in Libya, the East and the West, and the way money was being spent, there's a whole series of reconciliation that the new government's gonna have to work at. But we took the initial steps to get everyone speaking. It was a funny experience, or a fascinating experience for me, because I'd start every meeting saying I was facilitating and not there. And you had to facilitate, and occasionally you had to calm people, referee. But I'd end every meeting saying, is this useful? Do you want to do another meeting? And it was always unanimous. Yes, please do another meeting. It was always a very interesting thing that we did. These have continued, I believe. I don't know when the last one was done, but it's another area where, as a diplomat, you can engage, and often just using your good offices make some progress. And I think that's very, very important. And what would happen at these meetings is we would help draft the agreed minutes of what was decided, and that would become the basis for economic policy.
Mm-hmm. This is my last question, and it's going to be in two parts. I understand there's progress on a new interim political agreement that calls for elections in December. If you could tell us a little bit about that, the challenges, the opportunities, the players, and lead that in. I'm leading that into, we have a new president, President Biden. Do you see any major change in US policy regarding Libya?
Well, let me do the first part of what the new agreement is. New agreement has come forward with a plan to replace the GNA with a new transition government smaller one, basically of 3 people, that would lead Libya up to and conduct new elections, I think December 24th of this year. It's a very ambitious plan. Everyone looked at it, and there's lots of naysayers, like there always is in Libya. But I have to say I'm optimistic. I've been accused of being optimistic before, but I think it's certainly possible that this could work. A couple of things have happened with this. We've already seen a reaction to it internationally, where the United States has come out in favor of it. Turkey issued a statement, has come out in favor of it. Egypt has come out and issued a statement. The way it worked is there was an election they had 75 delegates. They put together a slate. There was a runoff election, and one group managed to get 36 votes, I believe. I think it was just enough so they could go forward. It's going to be very, very tough. It's going to be very hard to get it done. But if they focus on getting the election done and a constitution, and not try to solve every other problem. It's within the realm of possibility to do this. I was in Nepal where we had a similar situation where we had an interim government that stepped in for a period of months to conduct an election. It can be done. The problem in Libya is the international spoilers and all the other people that spoil is that there's a lot of people who won't get their way with what if this goes forward and is successful, and how are they going to react? I think we have to wait and see. I was just this morning reading the press on how is Haftar going to react to all this. Thus far, he's on board. We'll see. He obviously is a force that will have to be reckoned with politically and how this all works. But I think we have to give it a chance. And I think the only way it can succeed is on a multilateral basis with multilateral support. And I think it's also one where I think the foreign actors that are in place now, Turkey, Russia, the UAE, are going to have to step back. And how does that happen? And I think that's where on a multilateral basis, using the UN, I think pressure can be brought on. I also think this is one where the Europeans have a unique opportunity if they can come up with a unified position, i.e. a position that includes both France, Italy, Germany, all the senior players there, to make this happen. I'm optimistic. It will not be easy, but it's certainly in the realm of the possible. And then see what happens with an election. I mean, one of the things I've always been struck with in all of my dealings with the interim Libyan governments, the GNA, Prime Minister Siraj and his cabinet, is that there are many, many talented people in Libya. Things have just gone astray and awry, but given the opportunity and some stability, this is their country and they will make it work. I think one key difference between this and the way the GNA is formed is the panel and who's going to run this government was decided by Libyans in a vote. And already that's a key change. The fact that you had the head of the House, Aguila, was involved. He didn't win the election, but he was involved. It was an endorsement of the process. So should everyone honor their agreements and let it go forward, I think it's possible. Now, will this mean a major change in US policy? No, I don't think so. You know, one of the things you learn as a US ambassador is sometimes you serve in a country where you're in a sort of third tier level of senior policy interests. And I always said Libya is not in the first tier, it's in the second tier. There are many, many other things the new administration is focusing on right now that take a higher priority. That said, success in Libya is important, and failure in Libya could disrail an awful lot of other things. So I think it will have tension, but I think what we'll see is US engagement, but through multilateral fora and making sure it happens multilaterally and working with our European partners to keep the pressure on, particularly in terms of getting the players out and getting the Russians out, or the Russian mercenaries out, getting the UAE to back off and the Turkish government to withdraw. One of the things I have to say, and where we do bring some, I think, unique influence to the process, in addition to just being the United States, is we were always very frank during my entire tenure of everything we were doing. I went all over Europe. I briefed the Turks, I briefed the Qataris, I was in the UAE a lot. We always let everybody know ours. And I think using our good offices is a very, very important thing we can do. I'll stop there.
Well, great, Peter. This has really been informative. I very much appreciate it. I'm sure Tom will field some questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Jackson. And indeed, we do have a few questions. The first comes from Dr. Hassan Sassi. And he's wondering what you consider to be the primary challenge faced by the newly formed government. He asks, can it be another form of a GNA that failed miserably over the past 5 years? And what would be your advice?
Well, certainly it could be that, but I'm hoping it won't be. My advice would be is don't take on too much. Focus on getting the election done. First, my primary focus would be the election. The Constitution could even happen afterwards. But if they limit their focus to that and getting the two sides speaking and keeping everybody as many people in the inclusion of what they're trying to do. But the key is to create the stage for free and fair elections in December this year. I think that can happen. The part that the government itself can't control is what the foreign partners do.
Thank you. And this question comes from Samir Avrakis. The way that you described the way the Libyan government functions, would you call it a failed state?
I hate to use that term. I think there were a lot of people trying to do their very best. Has it worked the way we all wanted it to? No. But I think I'm not to the point yet where I could call it a complete failed state. There's many things that don't work, but there's some things that do.
Thank you. And this question from Cy Chadley. Who are the spoilers to whom you referred?
The spoilers are people that create the conditions, like what was enabling Haftar to invade Tripoli, in this case, the UAE, the Russians. To a certain extent, there's been media reports, the French government was involved in that as well. Anyone who takes away from letting the GNA get to its natural thing of creating the conditions for a new constitution and new election, those are the spoilers I'm referring to.
Thank you. And this question from Mr. Jack Friedlander. What are Russia's and other countries' interests in being engaged in Libya? And are they in conflict with those of the United States?
It's a very good question. I think you'd have to go through and look at each country, and we don't have time for that. Let me just focus on Russia. Russia's interests there, I think, are twofold. One, it's a way to create problems for us. It's a way to exert their influence in a way that causes us problems. If you look at media reports and analysis that's been done recently, I also think there's talk of them wanting to maintain air bases or warm water port access in the Mediterranean. This obviously, in terms of NATO, could be a long-term issue. The other thing which gets very little discussion, but I think is a very real issue, is the whole question of energy. And, right now, Russia exports an awful lot of gas and everything else to Europe. And one of the things, there's been tremendous fines off the coast of Libya. The Italians already do some of that. There's been talk of Turkish exploration, but how the whole energy factor could enter into it. So, and who controls that, or is there a way to control it? It's very interesting now is the Italians have had a long-term investment there. They produce gas offshore, it comes onshore to Libya where it gets dried and filtered. But most of that gas is used in Libya right now. It can be exported north to Italy, but the majority of it isn't. But there's tremendous, tremendous possible resources there. So I think that's a factor to be included.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a question from Mr. Stephen Stapp. Will there be a role for USAID to help rebuild Libya, and to what degree is this anticipated? What would that role be?
I think there's certainly a role. USAID is there already, and there's many things we can do. This isn't to say that we have to rebuild everything, and I'm not talking about major construction projects and things like that. The Libyans have the money, the wherewithal, the capability to do that themselves. But there's expertise and things aid can do to help in the interim. There's a tremendous amount of work aid can do in terms of helping organize an election and democracy efforts. One of the things aid, I should have mentioned this before, I was negligent, is in terms of the CERT air campaign. One of the things we did very, very quickly was with aid, was able to get some programs going right on the ground in CERT after the air campaign was done, to give the people of CERT hope that it wasn't just about an air campaign. It wasn't just about ridding Libya of ISIS, but of giving them a way forward for the future. I think there's a very positive role for aid to play. They're on the ground now. They have the expertise. And as the world's leading development agency, I think it's the question of coming up with things they can do that the Libyans want them to do, and using our expertise and leveraging our influence. We had tremendous coordination in terms of development assistance and aid with the UN, with USAID and the international partners already. And I would think as the new government takes place, as they have successes, this is just a place where we could do even better.
Thank you. And a question from Mr. Carl Heft. What role do you think Italy should be playing in the current situation?
I think Italy already plays a very positive, generally a positive role. They've played a long historical role, but I think they have a new role to play in it, making sure that Europe speaks with one voice, and how they can help. I think a lot of Europe's policy, particularly in Italy, has been based on concerns about migrants and what can be done there. But I think a stable Libya would certainly help solve that issue too. That's the key.
It's the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. And I think many would describe the situation in Libya in the past decade to be chaotic. Many people point to the Tunisian model as a formula for how to reestablish a stable state. Do you see applications for the Tunisian model in Libya, and how would those compare and contrast?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I lived in Tunisia and enjoyed it very much and saw their success. I think Tunisia has done a good job of solidifying the democratic institutions and processes that are necessary. I know their economy still faces some challenges, but the key to all this is how do you balance institutionalizing democratic institutions, getting your economy moving. I think there are lessons that Libya can take from Tunisia. I also think that the Libya's immediate neighbors, both Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, have all desperately wanted to help Libya in their efforts to do so. And if the new government has any success, they'll be standing by to do so. And I think there's a great possibility there. What specific aspects of the model, I think that's up for them to work out, but I think it can work. But you have to focus on the economy.
You know, reading about Libya, I couldn't help but think that we've seen this movie before. You know, we have centuries of foreign conquest, followed by decades of imperialism, followed by world war and civil war. But I saw something in there about historically the 4 or 3 regions within Libya. And then there's been recent talk about partitioning as a solution. Can you talk about that? Is that realistic? Can Humpty Dumpty be put together again, or does Humpty Dumpty even exist after all these years?
I think it exists. And I think the worst tragedy for Libya was if it ever were to be partitioned. I think, quite frankly, it's much stronger and has a much more viable chance to play a positive role for its citizens and in the world as a neighbor together. And I think the focus has to be there. I think to do that, as the new government and elections happen and things, you have to make sure there is tremendous inclusion. There probably has to be a better job making sure that resources are equitably distributed and wealth, the oil wealth gets to more people throughout the country. But you have to also understand that despite centuries of existence, during the Qaddafi years, governance was not an easy thing. Things did not always go as well as people thought they did. And it wasn't designed to make things work well. So I think there's a lot to be done, but partition would be the worst possible outcome.
Well, thank you. I don't see any further questions in our queue. So I'm going to turn the program over to our World Affairs Council of Orange County chairperson, Nora Valenzuela, to bring the program to a conclusion. Nora?
Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ambassador Bodie, and thank you, Ambassador Jackson. Indeed, was very, very informative. I certainly learned a lot. As I was listening to you, Ambassador Bodie, you mentioned about your colleagues that how important it was to have trust, cooperation, and also consistency in our policies within international affairs or relationship with other countries. And my personal view, a person who was born in another country, lived in many countries, and now, of course, US is my home and my country, is that the role of our ambassadors are absolutely critical in the long-term relationship that we have with other countries and diplomats. And that's why I'm always excited when we get ambassadors and diplomats in our programs, because your roles are about win-win. It's about finding a common ground of understanding the cultural, political, economical, and all the other challenges that those entities meet, and be able to find that common ground. And the danger I see sometimes personally in our foreign policy is that in the middle of a very important engagement, we pull out that resource that was so effective and simply replace them with another resource in that role who may be a very competent person, who may be amazingly effective, but they just don't have the cultural and the personal relationship with that entity and the historical knowledge or the relationship. So I'm hoping in the future, as you know, our country changes and goes through the lessons we've learned, that we recognize the importance of bringing back the strength into our US diplomacy. And I'm happy to see that World Affairs Council and our position with educating the public is in fact trying to be a bridge of communication and help our audience understand the important work you folks do. We don't hear of you folks on a daily basis on the news. We hear if there is a war in part of the world and if there is a political issue in part of the world, but we don't hear of the good work that the diplomats and ambassadors are doing and how critical that is. So I hope that we continue being able to provide that education, but in behalf of our Board of Trustees and also Executive Board and our audience, which I saw were as far as Santa Barbara and Northern California, I wish to thank you. And I hope that when we have in-person events, you will have a chance to join us and we can shake your hand. And thank you for your service to our country. We appreciate that. We truly appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you in person one day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
I'll be
you,
in contact.
ambassadors.
I'll be following up with a note to both of you. So we'll stay in contact. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon. Please look out for our next webinar that is coming up Thursday of next week at the same time. And be safe, everyone, and have a wonderful holiday weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.